Now, the reason I started this YouTube channel was to share my story on how I built my wealth and also some practical investment strategies around me, which might help some of you who might be interested. But some of you guys asked me some questions about who I am and where all my knowledge on finance and macroeconomics comes from. So while I was not planning to do so, I decided to share some bits and pieces of my stories of my life as a series to give some information on what I've been doing my entire life and what kind of person I am. I do want to note that the stories are very informative and maybe helpful and entertaining for some of you watching, so please watch the full series to get a full picture of the story. Now, ever since I was a little boy, I love to read the news. Now, when you're in elementary school, most kids care about gaming, pop stars, and WWE, but strangely, I was more into factual news, especially how the world actually worked. Back in the days when I was a kid, the internet was just getting started, so the only way I was able to get access to such news was through newspapers and things like the Time magazine. Whenever I read the news, I was interested in the things that were happening in the world, like how new companies were built, how one company buys another company, how some countries go bankrupt, and how the things I used and ate, like the Walkman, Cocoa Pops, or Fruit Loops, were all made by some companies to which I was paying money to. When I grew up older and went on to attend high school, all I wanted was a super high-paying job after graduating college. I also came to realize that there are certain professions in this world which pays a lot of money and which also specializes in tracking, monitoring, advising, and investing in those companies or countries. Soon I also came to realize that there are multiple jobs which does these roles, including investment banking, private equity, hedge fund, research analyst, and etc. In my high school days, I read a few books related to those professions, and while the concept of those jobs were hard to get a sense on, I decided that I wanted to become an investment banker. Now, I didn't really even understand what this job does. All I knew was that, number one, you can make a lot of money, and number two, you get to advise companies on big decisions, and number three, if you work in investment banking for a few years, you can access multiple other professions, such as going into private equity, hedge funds, or taking on an important role at a large company like a CFO role. The first step I had to take was to go to a good school. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about how I studied really hard and all that, because that's all boring stuff, but just to get to the point, I fortunately got into a top 10 school in the United States. Based on the US News ranking, the top 10 schools are Princeton, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Caltech, Duke, Johns Hopkins, Northwestern, and University of Pennsylvania. So I got into one of those schools. I majored in economics, and while I was in college, there were some radical events like the global financial crisis with Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns crashing down, but I continued to pursue my goal. In my junior year in college, I started searching for application windows for internship positions at investment banks. Though I vaguely remember, I think I applied to around 10 to 15 investment banks, including Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Merrill Lynch, Credit Suisse, UBS, Deutsche Bank, Macquarie, BNP Paribas, and etc. I thought a lot of the banks were a stretch and was hoping to just get into one of them. The position I applied were all investment banking division M&A analyst roles. After some time, I started to hear back. Surprisingly, I only got interview offers from 4 banks: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Merrill Lynch. Now, I'm not a strong believer in the tiering of the banks, but only getting interview offers from some of the top banks and getting sorry emails from the rest was strange. But anyways, interview dates got set up and the formats were pretty much the same across all banks. I had about 2 to 3 phone interviews with each of the bank. Questions I was asked at the interview were mostly within the scope of my expectations. Some of the ones I remember were, tell me about yourself. What are your observations on currencies in recent months? What are some valuation methodologies or matrix? Walk me through a DCF. What's the difference between EV/EBITDA and price to earnings? Why investment banking? Why M&A? I mean, most of the questions were pretty easy and I managed to answer them comprehensively. After a few weeks, I got final round interview offers from Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley. I remember I was extremely sick with a fever a few days before the final interviews and had to borrow some medication from my roommate and almost crawled into the planes to make it to New York. Super Day was held at their headquarters in New York, and the format was a bit more tense with the candidates waiting in the hallway and each candidate going into interview rooms with interviewers in each of the rooms. I think I entered around 3 to 4 rooms which had around 2 to 4 interviewers each. Questions I was asked were similar to the ones from the previous round, but I do remember that I was asked a few brain teaser questions which were a bit tricky, but I did manage to answer them correctly. So the questions were generally manageable as well despite the bad health conditions. After the interviews, I was intensely waiting for the feedback. I heard nothing for about a week, which made me even more nervous. But after another few days, when I was in my chemistry class, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I barged out, picked up, and it was one of the recruiters from one of the 3 banks I interviewed. The recruiter said that they're happy to extend me a summer internship offer at their investment banking division and will be formally reaching out to me soon. I think I literally ran around the campus for a while in joy and disbelief. After spending some good times in college, I started my internship at the investment bank in June. But unlike what I expected, I came to realize that I was in hell. I'll share more stories in the next episode. In my previous episode, I talked about how I got into the top investment bank. I got the summer internship offer. I started working as an intern in the mergers and acquisition team of the investment bank. My internship started with an office tour, which was just amazing. The glass building with a view of the river and spacious offices with marble walls, and just something which made me feel so good about myself. After a short orientation and a week-long training, the 10-week internship started. When I hit my desk, I was placed in a cubicle with all other interns. As I hoped, I was placed in a team which mainly conducts mergers and acquisition. Basically, we were advising companies which are looking to acquire another company or seeking to sell their company to buy or sell at an ideal price, which would yield the most return for our client corporates. The work itself sounded so much fun, and the initial work I did was generally in the range of my realm of my knowledge, so not much challenge was involved. There were a lot of gathering among the interns, and we had a lot of sessions with senior mentors about the firm and how we should change our mindset towards serving our clients with the best advice. However, when my internship headed towards week 3, the associate and the analyst in my team came up to me and said that I should now really get involved in active life transactions so that I can prove that I'm capable enough to join the firm as a full-time employee. I felt I was ready for it, so I started working on the live transaction. Now that's when the door to hell opened up to me. Working on the transaction was a totally different story. My seniors were giving me tasks which seemed impossible to be completed in a single day, and they were demanding me to finish the work by the next morning. For example, at 5 p.m., they asked me to draw up a 10-page PowerPoint by the next morning. But in order to draw those pages, I had to do a huge amount of analysis within Excel to derive key messages and extract numerical inputs that are required to put into the page. Just to give you a simple example, in order to draw a single introductory page on a company, you would need to do many things in advance. Number 1, you would need to download the 10K filings from the SEC website, extract all the key numbers, including financial statements, business breakdowns, revenue split by region, profitability trend, number of employees, profiles on the management. And also, number 2, based on the data you extracted from the filings, you would need to do a trend analysis on the Excel to see whether the company is performing well or badly. And number 3, based on your findings, you would need to find the reasons why it was performing well or badly based on extensive news run. After you have done all those things, which takes hours and hours, you can only start putting together a 1-page PPT for your seniors to see. Now imagine doing that for 10 pages. No one can do this in a single day as an intern. When I try to find out why this is needed to be done by the next morning, basically, the client asked for it out of the blue and asked for it by the day after. So in order for the seniors to review and provide comments, which would generally take another day for me to turn the comments, I had to get it done by the next morning. Sometimes they would make me redo the whole thing because the analysis I've done really was not what they were looking for. So the bottom line is, I figured out that in this industry, if the client asks us to do something, even if it may seem impossible, we somehow had to get it done. Also, when there's a deal going on, the timeline is extremely sensitive depending on deal dynamics. For example, the bid date may be right around the corner, and the client may need to go through unexpected internal multiple procedures to get the approval to up the bid or prepare funding to acquire the company, which requires an extreme amount of work, which also gets thrown to us as well. One instance, I was working on a deck for my seniors, which was ultimately for the client, and after pulling an all-nighter, I finally came up with a draft of the presentation at around 10 a.m. the next day. I was drafting the email to send the draft deck to my analyst, and just when I was about to hit the send button, my phone rang, and it was the analyst who I was about to send the email to. He said, "Hey, change of plans. I'm with the client right now, and there's been so many changes in our strategy, so the deck you were working on is no longer needed." And he said, "Can you start working on another 10-page deck with a different message?" He said, "Please make sure to include the revised comps analysis and an updated precedent transactions table. Please send it to me by tomorrow morning." I said, "Sure, will do," and hung up, but so many thoughts just spiraled in my head. Dude, I just pulled an all-nighter and haven't slept for 27 hours, and you're expecting me to pull another 24 hours from here? That's over 50 hours with no sleep. And I was dead sure he knew that I pulled an all-nighter yesterday. But what choice do I have? I just got up, went home, which was like 5 minutes away from the office, took a brief shower, and came back. I couldn't take a nap because I knew that the moment I lay down in bed, I'll just pass out and not wake up for 10 hours. So that's the kind of life I had to live through the 10-week period. The funny thing is, though everything sounds impossible, all the work somehow got done. Whether it's emergency staffings on a task to accelerate the work or begging the client to give us a few more hours to complete the promised task, all the time we somehow got it done. While doing my internship, I kept on thinking to myself, am I happy? As I said, I enjoyed reading the news and had genuine interest in how the world worked and how companies and the market worked. I was doing that job, but only getting like 30 hours of sleep or even less every week was killing me. Even on my last day of my internship, when I was supposed to go back home, pack and go back to school, I pulled an all-nighter the day before. I was on the phone for like 8 hours with my director, who was giving me instructions all night to make changes in a model. And by the time interns were saying goodbyes to their team members in the other side of the office, I had to tell the director on the phone that, "Sir, I think the firm is now shutting off all interns' computers and we need to leave." He kept on saying, "Let's just finish this tab before you leave." Anyways, that's how my internship ended. I came back to school and waited for the firm to call me on whether I actually got accepted as a full-time employee. In the meanwhile, I was thinking hard whether I should really go back to that place even if I got the offer. About 2 weeks after I finished my internship, the company called me and told me that I got the full-time offer. I told them that I'll get back to them in a day or two. I'll share more stories in the next episode. So in my previous episodes, I shared my stories on how I got the summer internship job at the top investment bank and how I survived the 120-hour-a-week working hours during the internship, and that I got the call from the investment bank offering me a full-time analyst role. So after I got the phone call from the firm, I gave a lot of thoughts on whether I should go back into investment banking as my first job. The questions I kept asking myself was, number one, would I be happy working there? Number two, would I learn a lot working there? And number three, would I make a lot of money working there? The answer to question number 2 and 3 were yes, but I couldn't give a clear answer on the first question. Nonetheless, I decided to take the job. The reason I made up my mind was because, number one, I came to a conclusion that job, which has a yes answer to all 3 questions, don't exist. And number 2, I can decide to quit anytime after I join the firm. And number 3, investment banking opens up the door to many other opportunities which would allow me to shift my career towards other professions if I wanted to. So I decided to give it a shot. After I joined as a full-time analyst, things were actually okay than I expected. I was somewhat used to the job given the 10 weeks of extensive training I got from the internship, and I knew people around the office, so I had a sense of how things worked around the firm. But the stress you got as a full-time analyst came in 3 folds. Number one, there are infinite amount of things to learn. So even if you get more used to the job, you still find yourself pulling all-nighters now and then as you're demanded to do more work day by day. And number 2, you feel like you're consistently in a competition against other analysts. Investment banking tiers and ranks analysts every year, and based on the reviews and feedbacks that you get, they determine how much bonus you'll be getting. And this feedback really determines your market reputation, which impacts your recruiting for private equities or hedge funds down the road. Number 3, politics. The work you do and your reputation around the firm depends heavily on who you work with. So if you work with capable seniors who gives clear guidance, has good connections around the firm, and always work on high-profile deals, you'll have a much better chance of being a top-tier analyst. This is because a senior with good connections and more say around the firm will most likely have the power to put in good words for you at the year-end discussions on bonus allocations. So in order to survive, I set a few principles of my own. A, always say yes to work. The only times when I would say no would be under severe circumstance. For example, if a senior wants me to get a work done in the next 3 hours, but I'm about to get on a 6-hour flight for a business trip, I'll inevitably have to say no. But even then, never say no, but ask the senior if I can get back to him in 6 hours instead of 3. That way, I can do the work during the flight and send it right after I land. B, always think a step ahead from a senior's perspective. In order to do so, I always review my work once or twice more from the reader's perspective to see what kind of questions might pop up. For those potential questions, I either revise the materials to address those questions in the materials itself, or prepare a side material so that I can answer those questions right away. C, whenever I had the chance, I tried to get coffee or meals with the seniors who I felt like had a lot of power in the office. It consistently appeared that I wanted to work with them as much as I can and try to build good relationships in the back scene so that I don't get rejected. Now, those principles aside, work was extremely tough. For one instance, on the day before, I was given a task to complete by 6 p.m. the next day. I actually had a business trip which the flight was scheduled to take off at 8 p.m., so I sent the draft early at around 4 p.m. At around 6 p.m., my senior came back with comments and demanded that I complete it in the next 3 hours. Given it was 6 p.m. and my flight was taking off at 8 p.m., I only had 2 hours, and taking into account of the boarding time, realistically, I only had 1.5 hours to complete it. I tried to crush the work out of my way before getting on the flight in the lounge, but obviously I couldn't finish it in time. So I continued to work even after boarding the flight, and as the takeoff time came closer, the flight attendants were urging me to turn off the electronic devices. I didn't stop and continued with the work because I had to send the email out before the flight took off. By the way, there was no in-flight Wi-Fi back then, so I was relying on the hotspot Wi-Fi on my phone to search the data and put together the materials. The takeoff time was like imminent, and the flight attendants were almost screaming at me, and people around me were giving me looks, but I didn't stop. The plane even started moving slowly, and just before the plane wheels detached from the ground, I was able to complete the work and shut down my laptop. But even so, all throughout the flight, I was under a severe stress as I was worried if there were any further comments on the materials. Luckily, I think I somehow got by. Another instance I remember was when I was around 4th year into the job and was working on a high-profile M&A transaction with a private equity client. That client was a practically insane one, which did not give us a single minute of rest. One instance, I was working on a model on a Friday, and they had an internal meeting on the Monday of the next week, which required the model to be completed over the weekend. They were so desperate to finish the model that they actually took turns sleeping while I was consistently working in the office. So on Friday, I would complete the draft of the model and send it to the client at around 1 a.m. Then the client who was standing by in the office would provide his comments demanding it to be turned by 9 a.m. Then he would go to sleep. I pulled an all-nighter and sent the work by 9 a.m. And just as I was about to go home on the Saturday morning, another person who took turn with the other guy and standing by in the office would call me providing live comments and demanded the comments to be turned by early afternoon the same day. Then the guy would leave the office, and the other guy who was there yesterday night would come back after his sleep and stand by for me to send them the draft. This went on and on over the weekend, and I ended up only having the chance to go home on Monday afternoon. So from Friday until Monday, I never left the office. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But it really happened. I'll share more stories in the next episode. So in my previous episodes, I shared my stories on how I broke into the top investment bank as a summer intern, how I got through the internship, and how I started working there as a full-time analyst. As I said in my previous episodes, basically I was getting sandbagged, hammered, and smashed every day at work. But another thing that was really giving me a hard time was that my world outside of work was collapsing. As an analyst, I was working around 80 to 100 hours a week on average, and when you work that much, there's basically no time to take care of other shit. It's impossible to make prior dinner arrangements with your friends and family, and even if you do, there's a good chance that something might pop up right before the dinner, so that you just can't make it to the dinner. So my strategy was just not make any prior arrangements on a weekday, and even on weekends, I usually just made myself available for Saturday brunch or lunch. Now, thinking about it, I think there were some times when nothing urgent actually came up over the weekend. But because I refused to make any appointments with friends and family, I just ended up staying home and just playing video games or whatever. I think the mentality there was that given the chance of work popping up was not zero at all times, from a certain point, I started feeling a lot safer just hanging around by myself and just eliminating any chances of pissing off other people by canceling lunch or dinner a few minutes before the mealtime. So the bottom line is, I was pissing off my friends and family one way or the other. If I say yes to making plans, I would piss them off by canceling the plan right before the agreed time. And if I say no, I would just piss them off on the spot. Now, one thing I realized about human beings is that if you make 5 lunch or dinner plans with somebody and you cancel it once right before, after making it 5 times on time, that one time you canceled is what people are going to remember and keep complaining about. I mean, it's understandable given I just screwed their precious weekend or dinner times, but from my perspective, I was sparing my precious free time to spend time with very selected few people. But my genuine intentions were just forgotten and dismissed quite quickly. I don't blame them, but I just started avoiding everyone outside of work from a certain point. It was the same in a sense that I was pissing off everybody around me, but at least I felt less guilty about it. So outside of work, my relationships were falling apart. But even at work, things weren't always happy either. Now, while working in investment banking, one thing I had to endure was the layoffs. Now, I was lucky enough not to get laid off from my job, but I had to experience 2 major layoffs in the office. The layoff process was really shocking. So what happens is this. Somehow on the day the layoff happens, everyone somehow knew that it was a layoff day. I think there are some people in the investment banking division who had connections with people in the HR department, and the words generally spread a few days before. When the day comes, people came into the office earlier than usual and just sit at their desk, kind of pretending to do work. Then from around 10 a.m., some people in the office start getting calls on their desk from an unknown number, which they have never seen before. People who get the calls would stand up and go out the door. Then they would just never come back. After a few hours, security would come up to his or her desk and start packing everything on their desk in a box and just leave with those boxes. Hearing from the people around the office, what happens is the people who call the desk are the HR people. The person who gets those calls would be told to come to a conference room on a different floor, and in the conference room there would be some HR people and the head of the group. In our case, the head of our investment banking department. They would just read out the stuff on a piece of paper which just says that effective immediately you're laid off and all your mobile devices and computers will be shut off. Then you'll be guided towards the exit of the building and will never be able to come back in again. Then the security would just pack your stuff and send it to your home address through DHL. Now, hearing from my peers, the reason you get guided towards the exit immediately rather than having even some time to come back to your desk, pack your stuff, and say goodbye to people is because there were some instances in the past where people who got fired came back to the office and just made a big scene, like breaking things and screaming and shit like that. So that was how the system worked. Now, on a layoff day, there were a couple of friends of mine who were laid off. It was really heartbreaking and hard to see them go. Especially because in investment banking, you really depend a lot on your peers and office mates because, as I said, you more and more distance yourself from non-work related people. Anyways, so that's kind of how my life was in investment banking. But as I said in my previous videos, I continued to keep my principles, which were, number 1, always say yes to work. Number 2, always think a step further from a senior's perspective. And number 3, try to get coffee or meals with the seniors who I felt like had a lot of power in the office. On top of the 3 principles, I really dedicated myself hard to work and really didn't care about anything else. Though I was destroying some parts of me, like my relationships with my family and my friends, mental health, interests outside of work, my devotion to work did pay off. For 6 years straight in investment banking, I was selected as the top performer in the entire region, and not only did I get so much recognition in the office, but I also got top-tier bonuses every year. Just for your information, bonuses differ a lot in investment banking depending on how you're ranked among your peers, so your performance evaluation is something that really makes you care every year. Anyways, so that's the kind of things I was going through. But after spending about 6 years in investment banking, I felt that it's probably about time that I move on to a different career path. I'll be back with more stories in the next episode. So in my previous episodes, I shared my stories on how I broke into the top investment bank as a summer intern, how I got through the internship, and how I worked there for 6 years as a full-time analyst and associate, and some crazy stories like layoffs in the office and not being able to go home for 3 days straight. As I said in my previous episodes, basically, after being ranked as the top performer in the region for 6 years straight, I felt that it was time for me to move on. I'm going to go into the details of pros and cons of this job later in the video, but the main reason I decided to move on was because I felt like I was building too much animosity towards the world. As I said in my previous videos, I basically had no time to take care of myself and my family and friends. Whenever I had no work, I ended up staying at home playing video games and just chugging down whiskey all by myself because I was too worried that any time during the day my BlackBerry would just ring and work might pop up. Basically, my day-to-day routine was get up at 8 a.m., go to work, come back home at around 2 a.m. on average, play video games while chugging down whiskey, pass out drunk at around 3 a.m., sleep for 5 hours, and go to work again. I started to hate any hours between 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. on weekday or even weekends because I was mostly working like a zombie. I also hated good weather because this means that people are going out to the beach or mountains to chill while I was still in the office. I also hated vacation season because I was never fully detached from my work, and there were people who demanded me to work even when I was away on holidays. This eventually led me to just not even go overseas for vacations because I hated the uncomfortable feeling of being away, while thoughts of work were consistently torturing me mentally. Basically, I felt like I was becoming a person who cannot get along with the normal world. Whenever I heard questions like, "What are you doing this weekend? What are your vacation plans? What is your hobby? What kind of workout do you do?" I became extremely defensive and sensitive that I felt like my mental health was just getting destroyed. Now, having that said, after spending 6 years in investment banking as an M&A analyst and associate, I came to conclude the pros and cons of this job. Now, first on the pros. Number one, there's no other job which you can learn as much as this one. Basically, as a young, fresh out of college junior, you get to experience the most complex, high-profile M&A and IPO transactions, which involves the most quantitative and qualitative thinkings, leading to an extremely steep learning curve. Number two, you make a lot of lifelong friends and mentors. Basically, if you work in investment banking for a few years, the people you work with become more like comrades rather than some random dude you bumped into at a workplace. Basically, the empathy you have for each other is incomparable versus any other people you meet throughout your life, given they're more like your war buddies. Number three, you get to network with some of the most influential people in the corporate industry. Basically, if you work on an M&A transaction, you're communicating and working with the most influential people in a company who are founders, CEOs, and CFOs. Meeting and networking with people of such high caliber really grows you to be a better person. And number four, investment banking opens up the door to many new opportunities. After working in investment banking for a few years, basically you become a person who is capable of managing and handling the most important decisions made in a corporate. So you can either choose to go to the buy side of finance to become an investor at private equities or hedge funds, or go to a corporate to work in the strategy department, or go to startup as a CFO to manage potential M&As, fundraising, and take the company public. Number five, last but not the least, you make a lot of money. Now, everyone may have different definitions of a lot of money, but objectively, investment banking pays you a lot. On this topic, I'll cover it in detail in a separate video. Now, while there were a lot of pros in working in investment banking, as I mentioned, there were a lot of cons as well. I think I covered a lot of them in my previous videos, but let's recap. Number one, the workload is just too much. I mean, I repeat, it's just too much. I share my stories on how I pulled a 50-plus hour all-nighter straight, how I worked 120 hours a week, and also how I came into the office on a Friday and couldn't leave the office until Monday the next week. I mean, it's just unimaginable how much work this job gives you. And if you're a person with some sense of responsibility, you can't ignore the work. So you just keep ending up pulling all-nighters every now and then. Number two, you destroy your relationships with non-work related people, including your friends and family. As I mentioned in my previous videos, given work never stops, even during the weekend, I ended up not making any plans and refusing all requests, which really got on the nerves of people around me. I told you guys before, but human beings are very short-sighted. Even if you make it to dinner 4 out of 5 times, that one time you cancel due to work is all they're going to remember and keep complaining about. And number three, at some point, you start finding it hard to figure out what kind of person you really are. As I said previously, while working in investment banking, I rarely worked out, I didn't have hobbies, I didn't go on vacations that much, and I was losing my family and friends. So as a human being, you really become a super mundane work machine which operates in a very lame way with no notable characteristics or anything interesting. The only thing you can talk about is work, and the only thing you can do is work. Now, with those pros and cons, you'll realize that I listed up more pros than the cons. Now, I genuinely think that my experience in investment banking did a lot more good for myself than bad. I learned a lot, made a lot of good friends, and it has become a super concrete foundation for my future career. Now, I had a long, deep thought about what I wanted to do next. While working in investment banking, things that I found about myself is that, number one, I like finance as a job in general, and number two, I like analyzing things related to macro and companies. And number three, I liked meeting new people to talk about interesting stuff like new industries and the economy in general. So when I thought about my next career path, I explored jobs in the finance world, which would allow me to keep analyzing new companies as well as the macro trend. and which will also allow me to meet new people in diverse industries. While I explored and interviewed for many jobs, I concluded that working in a private equity or hedge fund, which makes credit investments, would be the best fit for me. Generally, credit investment is a broader concept where you can invest in sovereign bonds or companies in need of capital in the form of loans or hybrid equity. I chose a place where I can make investments in the form of any capital structures, including loans or equity, in companies which are either distressed or in need of capital to plan the next step, such as an IPO. So, having moved to the new place, I've been working at this new firm for almost 8 years now. Now, looking back, while it was a tough ride, I can comfortably say that my experience in investment banking has made me who I am today, and has equipped me with the relevant skill sets to make further progress in my career. So, while I was in a lot of pain back then, now, thinking back, I think it was worth the pain and efforts. So that's the end of my investment banking journey. For those of you who have stayed with me along the journey, I really appreciate you watching, and I'll be back with more videos very soon. So in my previous videos, I covered a full series on how I broke into the top investment bank and how I survived for 6 years. As I promised you guys, I wanted to break down the investment banking pay by disclosing exactly how much I was paid across the 6-year period. And I think some of you guys who watched my previous videos might be thinking, I mean, how much did this guy actually have to get paid to work 120 hours a week, 3 days straight, and shit like that without quitting? Now, I just wanted to caveat that I worked in investment banking from early 2010s, so the pay is obviously a bit different from now given the inflation and all that, so please take that into consideration. Also, all numbers are pre-tax numbers, and some numbers are approximate figures given I couldn't find all the exact records. Also, keep in mind that I worked in investment banking division, mainly handling M&A related work at one of the top investment banks, including Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and JP Morgan. By the way, it was really hard for me to find all the pay slips going back to almost 15 years ago, but I managed to find it. Anyways, let's get to it. So starting off with first year analyst phase, the base salary which I started was $70,000. I think this was the norm back then, and right now I heard this is quite a lot higher given the inflation in 2020 and 2021, but I also heard the bonus pay got terribly lower. So all in, I'm not sure how much it differs from the years when I was working. Now on the cash bonus, during your first year analyst phase, there's actually no formal bonus, but there's a thing called a stub bonus, which is paid around 6 months after you start working. Basically, this bonus is just a token of gratitude from the firm for your service, and there's no distinguishment among the peers given the limited period of time to assess how good you are. So basically, there was the base salary of $70,000 and a stub bonus which totaled $90,000. Now, going into the second year analyst phase, your base salary increases by $10,000. So I got $80,000 in total. Now, this is when your performance evaluation kicks in and you get bonuses based on tierings among the peers. I think only a few people got the top bonus, and I was one of them. To cut it short, I got $68,000 in total as my first full year cash bonus, and so my total comps for the year was $148,000. By the way, getting your first full year bonus feels weird because as a fresh out of college who's only been working for a year or so, getting a big check of this size really makes you feel like you achieved something big. And I remember some of my colleagues who rushed out to buy some stuff like expensive watches or cars and stuff like that. But for me, I think the only thing I bought was probably a set of DVDs, which I wanted to watch. I think I bought House of Cards, and apart from that, I just kept everything in my bank account. As I said earlier, the only thing I did apart from work was play video games and watch TV series and drink whiskey on my own, so enough said. Now, I do want to note something about your performance evaluation. Generally, based on my observations, if you're ranked as a top performer in your first year of work, your top performer status rarely changes. People's perspective on you gets locked in, viewing you as a top performer, and as long as you keep on doing what you have been doing, you're very likely to maintain your status. I think this applies to any job in general. Basically, vast majority of people's perception about other people is determined from the first impression they get from you. So if you went all in the job during the first 12 months of the work and you did well, your reputation around the firm will spread and it'll most likely not change. In reverse, I saw some colleagues who didn't devote themselves to work during the first few months and left bad impressions. Some of them tried to turn that around in the following years, but it was extremely hard to flip people's first impressions on you. Basically, even if you did a good job on something, people had doubts, like, oh, that must have been a one-off thing, or he must have done something similar before, or he must have gotten help from somebody. So it really takes double and triple the efforts to flip people's perception on you if your first impression was bad. I just wanted to share that observation with you guys for your reference. Going into the third-year analyst phase, my base salary was raised to $90,000. So as you can see, as an analyst, my base salary was bumped $10,000 each year, which was a pretty big jump every year. Now on the bonus, again, I was ranked the top performer in the region and was paid well. Now the bonus I got was $78,000, making it a total of $168,000 a year. Now after 3 years of analyst phase, you move on to become an associate. Generally, back in the days, associate promotions was not given to everybody. You basically have to go through some interviews with the seniors in the division who would score you based on your day-to-day performance evaluations, interview performance, and reference checks with your fellow teammates. I also went through this process and luckily I was able to get the associate offer. Now after you turn an associate, this is when you really start to make a lot of money. First of all, my base salary was $140,000. This was a $50,000 jump from your analyst base salary. So this was a huge increase compared to what you used to get. Now in my first year associate phase, I also got a top tier performance evaluation and got a bonus of $94,000. Also, when you turn an associate, you get a thing called a signing bonus. Basically, this bonus is given to all associates, but it requires you to stay with the firm for at least 1 year. If you leave before then, the firm will actually claw back the signing bonus. Some of my colleagues actually left before hitting the 1 year mark. And to my surprise, the $40,000 were actually clawed back. Anyways, so my total comps for the year was $274,000. Going into the second year associate phase, my base salary was $160,000. So as you can see, the annual increase in the base salary was around $20,000, which was higher than the $10,000 during my analyst days. Cash bonus I got in my second year analyst phase was $71,000. Now, you may notice that the bonus I got in my second year associate days was actually lower than the bonus I got in my first year associate phase when I got $94,000. This kind of event happens in investment banking. When the economy is bad and the whole industry underperforms, the investment banks generally have to give a lower bonus given the lower profit the firm brought in for the year. I remember that some of my colleagues were really bitter about it, but I was generally neutral towards the number. I mean, when the firm made less money in a specific year, it doesn't make sense to pay a big bonus, right? It's just the way it is. Okay, now going into the third year associate phase, my base salary was $180,000. This year, I got the biggest bonus across the entire 6 years of my time in investment banking. The bonus I got this year was $150,000. Now, given the low bonus I got in my second year associate year, this bonus seems super high, and while I was already planning on leaving the firm, I remember that I was super happy with what I got. So, as you can see, basically the economy and the firm was performing quite bad during my second year associate days, but it somewhat bounced back in my third year associate days. So you just have to remember that there can be ups and downs, and your bonus can also be impacted by how the firm performed. Generally, investment banks perform better when the economy is doing well. This is because when the economy is good and there's a lot of liquidity in the market, companies are more willing to go out to the market to buy other companies or take the company public. So naturally, there are more deal opportunities for investment banks. Okay, so with all that, I covered investment banking salaries and bonuses during the times when I was working in an investment bank. Having the salaries and bonuses revealed, this might be less than what some of you expected and more than what some of you expected. But I repeat that the pay scheme these days may be a little bit different from back in the days, given I worked in investment banking more than 10 years ago. But I hope it was informative for all of you watching, and I'll be back with more videos very soon.